The wind carried more than dust that day, it carried destiny. When Clara Monroe found the wounded son of Chief Noka bleeding beneath the canyon's edge, she knew saving him meant defying every rule of the frontier. One act of mercy in a land ruled by fear. One heartbeat between life and death. She tended his wounds as the storm closed in, unaware that the tribe watched from the shadows. By sunrise, their judgment would come, and what they chose to do in return would leave her utterly speechless. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The morning bled red across the desert, the sky heavy with dust that shimmered like fire in the distance. Clara Monroe pressed her scarf tighter around her face, the grit stinging her eyes as her horse trudged through the canyon's narrow throat. The land was cruel and endless sand, stone, and silence, but she had long learned that silence out here never lasted. She rode searching for blue sage and wild comfrey, herbs that could heal or soothe when her hands and thread had done all they could. The wind keened through the rocks like a mourning woman, and Clara thought of the men she couldn't save during the war, their blood soaking into the same unforgiving earth she now crossed. She told herself she'd left those ghosts behind when she came west, but every cry of the wind seemed to carry their names. The storm rolled in sudden, the kind that comes without warning on the frontier sand rising in spirals, the horizon vanishing in a wall of shifting red. She leaned low over her horse, trying to find cover beneath a ridge, when she heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Faint at first, nearly lost beneath the wind's scream, but human, desperate, a cry of pain. Clara froze. Every instinct told her to ride on, that nothing good ever came from following a cry in Apache territory. But she couldn't. She slid from her saddle, boots sinking into the soft earth, and called out, her voice whipped away by the storm. No answer. She moved toward the sound, pushing past the jagged rocks that jutted like broken teeth. The smell hit her before she saw him iron and blood. Beneath a ledge, half covered in dust, lay a boy, no older than 15. His chest heaved shallowly, the fabric of his shirt torn, soaked dark with blood. An arrow shaft protruded from his side, clean through the muscle but missing the heart by inches. For a moment, Clara just stood there, breath caught, her mind screaming that this was madness. Then she saw the markings on his neck, bold black paint, the kind only one tribe wore. The Apache, and not just any child. Around his wrist hung a woven talisman, turquoise and crow feathers, the mark of Chief Noka's bloodline. The realization struck like thunder. This boy was the chief's son, the heir of the fiercest tribe in the territory. Saving him would make her a traitor in the eyes of every settler from here to Fort Sumner. But leaving him would make her something far worse. The boy's eyes fluttered open for a moment, hazy with fever, and she saw the fear there, the same raw terror she'd seen in dying soldiers years ago. His lips moved, whispering something she didn't understand. Then his eyes rolled back. Clara's heartbeat thudded in her ears. Around them, the storm howled louder, sand tearing through the canyon like claws. She dropped to her knees, pressing her hands to the wound, feeling for life. There was still a pulse, weak, but there. Her mind spun through options. She could cauterize it, bandage it, at least stop the bleeding until help came. But help from where? She was alone, and time was spilling out of him like the blood soaking into the dust. She looked at the horizon, empty, red, and endless. Then she whispered to no one but the wind. Not today. Pulling the boy close, she tore her shawl in half and began to work, her hands steady though her heart trembled. Above them, lightning split the sky in two, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw movement at the canyon's rim, shadows watching through the storm. The rain came in sudden, heavy sheets, slashing through the dust and blood that clung to Clara's hands. For a moment, she just knelt there, staring down at the boy as the storm screamed around them, her mind a battlefield between reason and conscience. She knew the settlers' law. Every town from Santa Fe to Fort Stanton had posted it clear. Aid the Apache, and you aid the enemy. There'd been raids for months, burned farms, stolen horses, and bodies left as warnings along the trails. Men like Sheriff Halbrook had made sure the punishment for helping the Apache was swift and merciless, hanging without trial. Clara had stitched up those bodies before, settlers and soldiers alike, her own hands haunted by their lifeless weight. She told herself then that she was done taking sides, done bleeding for other people's wars. But now, staring at this boy barely old enough to hold a rifle, she felt that same helplessness she'd seen in her brother's eyes the night he died. She could still remember his last words, soft as wind. "Don't let the world harden you, Clara." And here she was, years later, standing on the edge of doing just that. The boy moaned faintly, blood bubbling at his lips. The wound was deep, the arrow angled cruelly through his ribs. She could leave him, tell herself it wasn't her fight. The desert would do the rest, and no one would ever know. But something in the way his fingers twitched, clutching at life, refusing to surrender, ignited a flame she thought long dead. Fear clawed at her chest as she yanked her saddlebag open, pulling out her needle, her flask, her dwindling roll of linen. Her hands trembled so violently she almost dropped them. She whispered a prayer she didn't believe in anymore, then bit her lip and broke the arrow's shaft clean in half. The boy cried out, the sound barely human, swallowed by the storm. She pressed a strip of her shawl into his mouth and forced the rest of the arrow through. Blood gushed, hot against her palms, dark as tar. She'd done this before, in field tents, surrounded by cannon fire, but out here, under the open sky, it felt different. Each stitch she made felt like a crime. Every pull of the thread a small rebellion against everything the frontier demanded of her. Every second feels like betrayal. Every heartbeat defiance. She poured whiskey into the wound, the sharp sting of it mixing with the scent of wet earth and copper. The boy's breathing steadied, ragged but alive. She tore what was left of her shawl into strips and bound his chest tight, praying it would hold until dawn. When she finally sat back, soaked and shaking, the storm had begun to die. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that made the hair on her arms rise. She could feel it then, eyes on her. From the cliffs above, shadows shifted, there and gone between flashes of lightning. Apache scouts, she thought. Maybe even the chief himself. Her stomach twisted. If they saw her touching their fallen, they'd think she meant harm. But if she left him now, he'd die for certain. She reached for her rifle, setting it beside her, not to defend, but to show she had nothing to hide. "No child deserves to die like this," she whispered, the words stolen away by the wind. She pressed a hand to the boy's forehead, felt the fever rising beneath his skin, and lifted her gaze to the storm-dark sky. "If they're watching," she murmured, "let them see I mean no harm." Somewhere beyond the thunder, she swore she heard a whisper carried on the wind, low, mournful, almost human. But when she turned, the canyon was empty again, save for the dying firelight and the echo of her own defiance. The fire was a stubborn thing against the canyon's breath, a small orange heartbeat that threw Clara's shadow long and ragged across the boulders as the fever inside the boy rolled and broke against her hands. She fed him whiskey in teaspoons and cool water from her canteen, pressing rag after rag to the wound until the bleeding slowed and the shallow rise of his ribs grew steadier. And all the while the world narrowed to the scent of iron and smoke, the hiss of the flame, the wet rasp of his breathing memories arriving like specters, the field tents, the shouted orders, her brother's hand slipping from hers under a tarp of mud, then being dragged back to the present by the sharp report of a distant coyote. The way its long call seemed to measure the distance between salvation and doom. She wrapped the boy tighter, then eased him into a half-sitting position against her saddlebags, his head lolling, dark hair matted with dust, his lips cracked, and she felt an odd kinship form between them, the same small, stubborn refusal to let go that had kept her alive through 2 winters of hunger, and she sang to him under her breath in a language that wasn't hers, nonsense lullabies stitched from the rhythm of the land, because sound felt like an offering to whatever watched from the rocks. The wind changed direction, bringing the faint smoke of a distant campfire, and with it the whisper of movement along the rim of the canyon. She had thought of the mouths that would curse her and the hands that would drag her to the gallows, and though each thought came with the cold iron taste of fear, her hands did not cease their work. She threaded the needle with the practiced speed of someone who had sewed more lives together than she could count, and mended the torn fabric of this boy's shirt, as if mending herself at the same time. There were nights when memory coagulated into guilt so thick it had weight. This night it thinned into resolve. She kept one eye on the boy, one on the dark. listening for anything that wasn't the wind footsteps, a whisper of cloth, the almost imperceptible quiet of a group pausing to watch, and every rustle made her breath hitch like a trapped bird. At one point, a silhouette detached itself from the rock face, a shape slim and taciturn. Clara's fingers found her rifle as if by muscle, memory alone, not to fire but to lean upon, to show the shape of readiness, and she reminded herself with a quiet, fierce voice that steadied her more than any whiskey. "If you come for him, you'll have to go through me." She thought then of the laws inked and posted in town, of Sheriff Halbrook's boots, and of men who had smiled as they condemned another to make themselves feel less afraid. And she let the righteous anger settle like coal under her ribs because it warmed her and gave her strength. The night deepened, stars pricked through the thinning storm like pinholes, and the firelight shrank and swelled with the boys' breaths. Once, twice, the canyon answered with a series of soft echoes that might have been voices speaking in a tongue she could not parse, or perhaps only the wind shaping itself against the stones either way. The feeling of being watched did not abate. She watched the boy's chest, watched his lashes flutter. She listened to the land count the hours in small, patient noises. She whispered his name when she could not remember if she'd been told his, or if she had given him one, because naming is a kind of promise. And when dawn first threaded pale through the canyon, turning the dust to silver, Clara felt the long, taut line of the night slacken a little in her shoulders, though the shadow on the rim remained, unmoving, as if the tribe itself had weighed the measure of her mercy and chosen, at least for now, only to look. The first light of dawn came bleeding through the canyon, soft and golden, brushing the sandstone walls in long streaks of fire. And for a fleeting moment Clara thought the worst had passed, that the boy might live, and the storm's rage had washed away whatever watched from the cliffs. But then she heard it. The rhythmic thunder of hooves rolling low through the earth, not rushed, not chaotic, measured, deliberate, closing in from all sides. Her pulse quickened. She rose, the ache in her knees forgotten, eyes sweeping the canyon rim. Out of the drifting morning haze they came shapes at first, ghost-like in the half-light, their silhouettes carved in shadow and dust, until the sun lifted just enough to strike their faces. Apache warriors, a dozen or more, their ponies silent beneath them, feathers and braids catching the wind like whispers of flame. Clara's hand found her rifle but did not lift it high. She held it low at her side, a gesture of wariness, not threat. Her throat went dry. She'd heard the stories, their vengeance swift, their judgment final, but nothing in those tales captured the gravity that now bore down on her. The leader came forward, his horse black as a midnight river, his presence commanding the very air. Chief Noka. Even before she knew his name, she knew it had to be him, the way the others parted for him, the way the canyon itself seemed to bow under his gaze. His face was unreadable, carved with lines of endurance and loss, eyes dark and sharp as obsidian, taking in everything: the fire's ashes, the rifle, the blood, the boy lying still beneath her shawl. Clara forced her breath steady. "He's alive," she said, though her voice barely carried, swallowed by the hush that had fallen over them. No one answered. The chief dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate, like a man approaching a grave. He knelt beside his son, fingers brushing the boy's chest where the bandages lay dark with blood. Clara stepped back, heart hammering, afraid to speak, afraid to move. The chief stayed there a long while, his head bowed, the silence stretching taut between them. The other warriors watched from the edges, hands resting near their weapons, eyes fixed not on their leader but on her. When Noka finally looked up, his expression was a storm of conflicting truths, gratitude buried under suspicion, grief warring with pride. His gaze lingered on her hands, the thread, the stains of red dried against her skin. For a moment neither of them moved, and in that stillness something unspoken passed, a recognition of shared cost, the understanding that saving life and taking it were closer kin than most would admit. He said nothing. Instead, he gestured to two of his men, who moved forward without a sound, their steps soft as the wind. Clara stiffened, gripping the rifle tighter, though she knew it wouldn't matter if they chose violence. She'd made her peace with consequence the moment she touched the boy. But the warriors didn't strike. One knelt and lifted the boy's arm gently, checking the pulse. The other inspected her stitches, muttering something low in their tongue. Noka watched it all, unmoving, until at last he rose to his full height, his shadow stretching long across the ground. "White woman," he said finally, his voice deep and measured, English thick with accent but precise. "You saved my blood." Clara swallowed hard, unsure if it was a statement or accusation. "I did what anyone should have," she managed, though even she knew the lie in that. The chief's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in assessment. "Anyone?" he echoed. The word hung like smoke. He glanced down at his son once more, then turned his gaze toward the horizon where the storm had died. And for the first time she saw the faintest crack in his composure, a flicker of something like mercy or perhaps only calculation. Whatever it was, it bound her fate to theirs before the sun had fully risen. The warriors moved as silently as windblown reeds, their grip firm but not cruel as they took Clara by the arms, pulling her away from the boy whose shallow breath still clung to the edge of life. Her rifle fell to the ground with a dull thud, the sound swallowed by the canyon's vastness. She didn't fight. There was no point. Her heart had already accepted the truth. This was how it ended. The stories she'd heard in taverns and camps about Apache vengeance came rushing back, half legend, half warning, and now she stood inside them. The chief stood a few paces away, his back straight, his shadow long against the light of the waking Sunday around him. The air hung heavy with dust and unspoken judgment. The boy's body lay at the center of it all, half shrouded in Clara's torn shawl, his chest rising faintly under the watchful hands of an old man painted in white clay and ochre, the medicine man. His eyes were clouded with years, his movements slow but sure as he unwrapped her bandages, sniffed the wound, pressed the flesh, muttered in the low rhythm of a prayer. Clara watched, her pulse pounding in her ears, aware that the chief's gaze never left her face. He stood there, silent as a mountain, eyes black and piercing, studying her as if trying to decide whether she was savior or snake. The minutes dragged like hours. Sweat ran down her back despite the chill of morning. Her lips felt cracked and dry, but she didn't ask for water. When the medicine man finally leaned back, he nodded once toward the chief and murmured something in their language, something that made the others shift slightly, the tension easing by a breath. The chief turned then, his features carved from stone, and spoke in slow, careful English. "You saved my blood. Why?" His voice was low, deep enough to rattle her chest, the question hanging between them like a blade. Clara's throat constricted. She thought of all the right things to say, but none would matter. Truth, only truth, could reach through the space between them. "Because I could," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. The words fell flat in the silence, small against the canyon's walls but somehow echoing all the same. A murmur passed among the warriors. The chief's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Your people kill ours," he said, his tone hard, almost accusing. His hand rose slightly, gesturing toward the hills, the direction where white settlers lived and built fences on stolen land. Clara's heart clenched. She could have lied, said she was different, said she didn't belong to them, but lies were cowardice, and she'd had enough of cowardice. She lifted her chin, tears threatening but unshed. "I know," she whispered. "And still, your boy breathes." The words struck like a spark in dry grass. The silence deepened, became almost sacred. The chief's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering to his son, whose eyes had begun to flutter faintly beneath their lids. A single tremor passed through the chief's frame, grief or gratitude, or both, and then he nodded once, sharp as a strike. "You come with us," he said. The order was simple, final. The warriors at her sides shifted, one retrieving her rifle, the other loosening his grip just enough for her to walk. She didn't know what "with us" meant mercy or captivity, but she felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a sentence. As they led her away, the wind carried the scent of sage and blood, and the boy's weak breath behind her was the only sound that reminded her why she was still alive. She did not look back, though she could feel the chief's eyes on her every step, measuring the worth of her soul. The blindfold was rough burlap, the kind that scratched and let in thin slivers of light that flickered like dying fireflies as they rode. Clara could taste the dust with every breath, each grain dry and bitter on her tongue, and beneath the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves she could feel her own heart thrumming like a trapped bird. The ropes around her wrists were tight but not cruel, and though she expected at any moment to feel the cold press of a blade or the sudden emptiness of being left behind in the desert, none came. Instead, there was only the sound of wind and hoofbeats, the occasional murmur of the warriors speaking softly in their language, voices like low music, and the realization that she was still alive. Every mile stretched like a lifetime. She tried to count the hours by the heat of the sun through the fabric over her eyes, first cold morning, then blistering noon, then a slow descent into the cool breath of evening, but the desert's rhythm was merciless and timeless. Sometimes, when the horses stopped to rest, she could hear the distant cry of a hawk or the rustle of something small moving through the sage, and once, a hand gentle, surprisingly gentle, pressed a canteen to her lips. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and managed to whisper, "Thank you," though she doubted anyone understood. But someone must have. Because when the journey finally ended and they removed the blindfold, the world that unfolded before her eyes was not the place of death she had imagined. It was a village, alive with color and movement, set in a wide basin where the earth turned gold and crimson under the lowering Sunday smoke curled from cook fires, and hides stretched between poles rippled in the breeze. Children ran barefoot through the dust, laughter echoing like birdsong. The air smelled of sage and roasted corn, of horses and wood smoke and life. Clara blinked, trying to make sense of it, the sudden brightness overwhelming after so much darkness. Her captors, or whatever they were now, dismounted first, then gestured for her to follow. Her legs ached as she stepped down, the sand cool beneath her boots. The chief was there, watching her with that same unreadable expression, his eyes glinting in the amber light. "No harm," he said simply, his English clipped, and with a single nod to his men, the ropes at her wrists were cut. She rubbed the raw skin, unsure if she should thank him or fear him, but before she could decide, a small group of women approached. They looked her over with wide, searching eyes, not hostile, but curious, as if trying to see the shape of her soul. Their whispers danced around her like wind. The white woman who saved the chief's son. Clara followed their gaze to the largest tent near the fire circle, its entrance shaded by deer hides painted with symbols of the sun and moon. Inside, on a bed of furs, lay the boy she'd fought to keep alive. His chest rose steadily now, the color returning to his face. The old medicine man she'd seen before was bent over him, grinding herbs, but when he noticed her, he did not scowl or spit. Instead, he gave a short, respectful nod, as though acknowledging her place in the story. Clara exhaled, tension slipping from her shoulders like water from a stone. She wasn't chained. She wasn't bound. But everywhere she turned, she could feel eyes following her, men by the fires, women carrying baskets, children peering from behind their mothers' skirts. Not hatred. Not yet. Something in between. The chief spoke briefly to a warrior beside him, then looked back at her. "You stay," he said, the faintest edge of command softening into something like patience. She wanted to ask why, to demand what they intended. But when her gaze drifted once more to the boy, his slow, even breathing, she understood that her fate, for now, was tied to his. And as the first stars began to rise above the desert sky, she felt the strange pull of two worlds shifting beneath her feet, neither of which would ever again feel like home. The days bled into one another like the shifting colors of the desert sky, the blistering heat of noon surrendering to the deep chill of night, and in that rhythm, Clara found a strange kind of peace she hadn't known she'd been searching for. The village became a world contained within the steady pulse of life, fires burning low, drums beating faintly in the distance, the laughter of children mingling with the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. She rose with the dawn each day, her hands rough from work but her heart lighter than it had been in years. The chief's son, whose name she had learned was Tahu, lingered between life and death for nearly 3 days before his fever finally broke. When his eyes opened, dark and clear as river stones, Clara was sitting beside him, grinding herbs into a paste under the watchful eye of the medicine man. For a long moment, the boy simply stared, as though trying to understand if she was real or some ghost of mercy. Then, in halting English, he whispered, "Thank you." The word hit her harder than any gunshot. It wasn't just gratitude, it was an acknowledgement of something deeper, something that crossed the boundaries drawn by blood and hatred. Clara smiled faintly and touched his hand, feeling the heat of life there, the pulse steady beneath his skin. "Rest," she said softly. "You're safe." From that day on, she was no longer just a stranger under watch. The old healer Kano, they called him, allowed her to stay in the tent, to help grind roots, mix salves, and apply poultices. He showed her plants she'd never seen before. Silver-leafed stems that soothed fever, cactus milk that closed wounds faster than any cloth could. His hands were weathered and sure, his silence filled with the weight of generations of knowing. Clara listened, learned, and for the first time, felt her purpose returning not as a nurse to one side, but as a healer to all. The tribe's women watched her differently now, their whispers turning from suspicion to curiosity, some even offering shy smiles as they passed. She began to share with them what she knew too: how to boil water before tending a wound, how to use the bark of willow for pain. It became an unspoken exchange, a dance of mutual survival, one lesson traded for another. At night, after the fires burned low, she sometimes sat near Chief Noka, the air between them heavy with the smell of smoke and rain yet to fall. He spoke more in those quiet hours, his voice low and even, telling her stories of the land before the rails and fences, of promises made by men who came with paper and guns instead of honor. He told her of hunger, winters, of children buried in unmarked graves, and of the endless march of soldiers who spoke of peace but carried fire. Clara listened, each word peeling back the skin of the world she thought she knew. She wanted to argue, to say not all settlers were cruel, but the truth settled in her chest like a stone. There were no sides here. Not really. Only wounds carved into different flesh. She told him of the war she had fled, of how she'd watched her brother die in uniform and how the flag on his coffin brought her no comfort. The chief nodded, understanding without judgment. "You carry ghosts," he said, "same as me." His gaze was steady, not condemning but searching. The fire cracked, casting light across his face, and she realized she no longer saw him as an enemy but as a man shouldering the unbearable weight of survival. And as the stars wheeled overhead, endless and ancient, Clara understood that healing was not the act of closing a wound, but of facing the pain it left behind, and she was not done healing yet. The warning came with the morning wind, carried on the hooves of a frightened scout who rode hard into camp, his horse lathered with sweat, his voice cracking with fear as he shouted the words that turned the air to ice. Soldiers coming from the east, maybe 30 strong, rifles glinting like teeth in the sun, flags flying red and gold against the sky. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the words spread, as mothers pulled children close and the men of the tribe began to gather weapons, their movements quick but silent, like a people who had lived this story too many times before. Chief Noka stood at the center of it all, still as stone, his eyes narrowing as the scout spoke. "They come because of the raid," the man said. "They say our people killed settlers near the river." But Clara knew that wasn't true. She'd been there every day, seen the tribe's quiet struggle to heal, not to harm. Her heart hammered as she stepped forward. "There was no raid," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "It's a lie." The chief turned toward her, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a weary sigh, he spoke. "The white men need no truth to draw blood." His voice carried no anger, only the exhaustion of a man who had watched too much dying to believe in mercy. Clara shook her head, stepping closer. "Then move them," she pleaded. "Take the children. Take the elders, go. The army won't stop. You can't fight them. Not this time." The chief's jaw tightened. "This land is our mother," he said. "Would you flee from your mother when the wolves come? No, you stand and you bleed for her." His words cut deep, not from cruelty, but conviction. Clara could see the tribe beginning to prepare for battle, bows strung, horses saddled, faces painted with the marks of death. It was madness, noble and tragic, and it broke something in her heart. She thought of Tahu, still weak but alive, of the women who had shown her kindness, of the quiet dignity in every gesture of these people the world called savages. She couldn't watch them die for a crime they hadn't committed. So, before the sun had climbed high, she made her choice. While the camp gathered and the chief prayed to the wind, Clara saddled one of their horses and rode out alone, her hair unbound, her heart thrumming with fear and fire. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, heat shimmering off the sand. her breath burning in her throat as she rode hard toward the sound of drums and steel. By the time she saw them, the line of bluecoats cresting the ridge, their rifles gleaming, her horse was trembling beneath her, foam at its mouth. She pulled the reins and slid to the ground, dust rising around her like smoke. The soldiers froze, startled by the sight of a lone woman standing before them, unarmed, her dress torn, her eyes fierce. The captain rode forward, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Step aside, ma'am," he ordered. "There's Apache to deal with." Clara stood her ground. "There was no raid," she said, her voice ringing clear across the canyon. "No settlers killed, only a wounded boy and mercy." The captain frowned, uncertain. "You've been with them?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "I saved their chief's son. You'll ride in there and kill women and children for nothing but rumor." A murmur rippled through the ranks, men shifting uneasily in their saddles. The captain hesitated, caught between orders and the raw conviction in her voice. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, he lifted a hand. "Hold," he said. The word hung like a fragile truce. Behind Clara, the wind rose, whispering through the sage, and for a moment the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, caught between war and the fragile, impossible chance for peace one woman's defiance had given it. The sky was bruised purple when Clara rode back into the valley, her horse stumbling from exhaustion, her dress stained with dust and dried sweat. She expected smoke, expected to see the village burning, to hear the echo of rifles tearing the silence apart, but there was only stillness, a fragile calm that felt almost sacred. The fires still burned in the distance, and the people were alive, gathered in quiet clusters, their faces turned toward her as she dismounted. She felt their eyes on her, not with suspicion as before, but with a strange kind of wonder, as though she'd stepped out of the desert itself carrying something unseen. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Men stood in silent watch. And when Chief Noka emerged from his tent, all sound seemed to fade. His gaze met hers, steady and unyielding. But there was something softer there now, something human that hadn't been before. Clara bowed her head slightly, unsure if she had the right to meet his eyes. "They're not coming," she said quietly. The army turned back. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the chief nodded once, a deep, solemn gesture that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "The wind spoke truth," he said. "You faced the storm, and it passed." He motioned toward the fire circle, where the elders sat waiting, the flames painting their faces gold and red. The tribe gathered, moving like a tide around her, their expressions unreadable but their presence heavy with meaning. Clara's pulse thrummed as she stepped into the circle, unsure what awaited her judgment, perhaps, or farewell, but when the chief stood before her, he carried something in his hands. It was a necklace, simple yet beautiful, turquoise stones strung with polished bone, glinting faintly in the firelight. She'd seen the women wear smaller versions, tokens of family or battle, but this one was different, its centerpiece carved in the shape of an eagle's heart. The crowd hushed as Chief Noka lifted it, his voice low and resonant. "Among my people," he began, "this belongs to those who stand when others fall, those who fight not with anger, but with spirit. You carry the heart of the brave." The word struck her harder than any praise she had ever received. When he placed the necklace around her neck, his hands were warm and steady, and for a moment, Clara could only stare at the gift resting against her chest, the weight of it almost unbearable, as though it held not just gratitude, but the burden of a people's trust. The women began to sing then, a low and haunting melody that wrapped around the flames, rising and falling like wind over water. It wasn't a song she understood, but its meaning was clear. Honor, remembrance, peace hard. One. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes as she looked at the faces around her, the same eyes that once watched her with suspicion now shone with respect, even affection. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Chief Noka's expression softened, a faint smile touching the edges of his mouth. "No one deserves peace," he said quietly. "They make it." The fire crackled, the embers flaring bright, and in that moment, Clara felt something inside her loosen, a knot of guilt and grief she had carried for years finally beginning to unravel. Around her, the tribe sang of courage and forgiveness, and the desert night seemed to breathe with them. She touched the necklace gently, feeling its cool surface beneath her fingers, and for the first time in her life, she believed that maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't something that belonged to nations or laws. It was something forged in the space between one human heart and another. The dawn came softly, spilling gold over the canyon walls and painting the world in light so gentle it almost felt undeserved after all the blood and dust. Clara stood by the edge of the village, her saddle already strapped, her few belongings packed neatly: thread, herbs, the necklace of turquoise and bone that rested against her throat like a heartbeat she hadn't yet learned to live without. The camp stirred slowly behind her, smoke rising from the morning fires, the faint hum of voices and laughter carrying on the wind. It was the sound of life moving forward, and though her heart ached to leave it, she knew it was time. A figure approached from behind Tahu, walking steady now, his steps sure. The strength returned to his once frail body. The boy she'd found half dead beneath the storm was gone. In his place stood a young man whose eyes carried both his father's fire and a gentleness all his own. He wore a simple band of red leather across his brow, a sign of healing, of renewal. "You are leaving," he said, not as a question, but with the certainty of someone who had already made peace with it. Clara nodded, tightening the strap on her horse. "The world won't heal itself," she murmured, "and there's work yet to do." Tahu looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and touched the necklace at her throat. "You are family," he said simply, his voice steady but thick with meaning. "Not by blood, but by spirit. You saved me. You saved my people." The words cracked something open inside her, and for a heartbeat she couldn't speak. Finally she smiled, a quiet, bittersweet curve of the lips that carried both sorrow and gratitude. "And you saved me too," she said. They stood there in silence, the wind tugging gently at her hair, the sun rising higher with every breath. When Chief Noka appeared at the edge of the fire circle, he didn't call her back, didn't ask her to stay. He only raised his hand in solemn acknowledgement, the same way a warrior salutes another before a long journey. She returned the gesture, bowing her head slightly, feeling the weight of his respect settle like a blessing. The women gathered behind him, their faces warm, their eyes bright with something she hadn't expected: hope. One stepped forward and placed a bundle of dried herbs into Clara's hand. "For safe path," she said in halting English, and Clara accepted it with a trembling smile. The air smelled of sage and smoke, the same scent that had clung to her since the day she'd saved Tahu, and now it felt less like something foreign, more like something that belonged. She swung into the saddle, the leather creaking beneath her weight, and for a moment she looked back at the tents glowing in the rising light, at the figures gathered near the fire, at the land that stretched far and wild and eternal. Then she clicked her tongue, and her horse began to move, hooves whispering over the sand. As she rode away, the sound of drums rose behind her, slow at first, then building, a rhythm that followed her across the open plain. It was not a song of farewell, but of remembrance, of the thread now woven between her heart and theirs. The frontier had taken much from Clara Monroe, her brother, her innocence, her faith in the goodness of men, but in one act of bravery, she had found something far greater, the bridge between two worlds that had never sought to understand each other. And as the wind rose, sweeping over the desert in long, mournful sighs, she closed her eyes and listened. In its voice, faint but certain, she could still hear them, their gratitude carried through the ages like a promise whispered to the earth itself.